Good afternoon. My name is, as you heard, Jørgen Sejersted, and I am professor of Nordic literature at the University of Bergen, Norway. And I am chair of the board of the Holberg Prize. And the Holberg Prize is very happy to be represented here in Jaipur, India. And we are proud to be a session partner of the JLF and to be co-hosting this particular event featuring Professor Stephen Greenblatt, as you heard, the Holberg Prize recipient of 2016, and the historian William Dalrymple, co-founder of this festival. You might never have heard of the Holberg Prize. Please allow me a few words presenting it. The Holberg Prize was established by the Norwegian government in 2003 and is administered by the University of Bergen. It is awarded to outstanding scholars within the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. The prize is awarded by the Holberg Board on the recommendation of an autonomous committee of international scholars, choosing carefully from nominations from around the world. The prize amount by today's currency is about 500,000 euros plus. The prize is awarded in gratitude and recognition of outstanding scholarly achievements, and we also aim to encourage international intellectual debate and to be a point of reference within the global community of academics and literates in our fields. One of the reasons we are here in Jaipur is to raise the international awareness of the prize, and specifically, we hope for more nominations from India and Asia through our website. So please, if you hold a position in an academic institution, consider the possibility of nominating a worthy candidate for the prize. I should also mention that in addition to the Holberg Prize, we award a prize to young researchers from or working in the Nordic countries. We call it the Niels Klim Prize. And the latest award winner of the Niels Klim Prize was Siddharth Serene, a very, very prominent young scholar who grew up in Varanasi here in India and is currently working in Norway. We also conduct an extensive school program for pupils and teachers in upper secondary schools in Norway, and every December we host the annual Holberg debate on pressing issues of our time. So please, again, visit our website for streams and further information of our activities. I now turn the attention to today's event. I am thrilled that we are cooperating with the 2016 Holberg Prize recipient, Professor Greenblatt. Greenblatt, as we heard, is the John Cogan University Professor of Humanities at Harvard University, and his latest book is Second Chances, Shakespeare and Freud from 2024. He's also author of best-selling books like Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare from 2004, and of course, The Swerve from 2011, a scholarly and yet highly entertaining description of how the 15th century humanist Poggio Bracciolini discovered Lucretius' Epicurean and strikingly modern poem, De Rerum Natura, and thereby might have altered the course of history, as we heard. This is an intriguing story which will be the starting point of today's discussion. Greenblatt has also published several other significant studies, and he was a leading proponent of new historicism. And on a personal note, as a literary researcher myself, I can say that I can vividly recall when I, in the 1990s, as a young researcher at the University of Bergen, first read Greenblatt's short but very distinct text, Introduction to Renaissance Self-Fashioning. That was a liberating experience for me as an academic. A very short text, but so clear, well argued, honest, and truly groundbreaking. So together with some of Greenblatt's early essays, it has heavily influenced my personal career. As I know, Greenblatt has influenced so many academics all over the world, showing how history can breathe and live within the literary studies. Discussing with Professor Greenblatt will be the highly celebrated India-based historian and writer William Dalrymple, co-founder of this wonderful festival and author of so many successful books of the history of India and other things. I trust he needs no long introduction from me. Even in remote Bergen, Norway, we have now read the shocking story of the East India Company and India in his bestseller, The Anarchy from 2019. And of course, we have heard about it in the podcast, The Empire, with Anita Anand. His most recent success is, as we heard, The Golden Road. So I'm looking very much to reading that last book. Now, I will not spend more of your time lingering on everything that Greenblatt and Dalrymple has written and done, and instead I will leave the scene to William Dalrymple and Stephen Greenblatt, two authors who have given thorough scholarship such a vast, vast outreach and large readership. So thank you for your patience, and please, Greenblatt, Dalrymple.
One of the great privileges of running a festival like this is that you get to meet your heroes and invite them to come here. This is Stephen's second visit to the festival. And he is every bit as engaging in conversation as he is on the page. The Swerve is one of my all-time favorite books, and it's a huge, huge pleasure to be on stage with my great hero. What I love about Stephen's writing is this fabulous lightness of touch that he puts into his books like Will of the World and The Swerve, which we're dealing with today. These are books which rest on, like an iceberg, on a sort of fantastic substrata of learning and deep knowledge which has been gathered over a lifetime, but presented with a magical lightness of touch, which allows you to absorb this wonderful learning. There is no example I know anywhere in the world of a major scholar who has written ground-changing works of literary criticism, who is also capable of just sort of magically turning his style into something which can be consumed with pleasure on a beach, as well as being hugely educational, inspirational, and bringing a subject to life in a way that few other authors can match. What we're going to do today is Stephen is going to give us a very brief presentation with some slides on The Swerve, which is a book he wrote some time ago, and I have bullied him to come and speak about it because it is such a foundational and central text for so many of us here in the audience. Then we're going to discuss it, and then discuss particularly, I think, the decisions he made about writing it in this hugely accessible way, and then open it up to you guys to join in the conversation. So, Stephen, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor and a huge pleasure to be here. And I just want to say before I begin how grateful I am to the Holberg Prize, to the Norwegian government. And I say this not because, though of course I don't neglect the fact that there was a lot of money in the prize, and I'm, as you've heard, but it's not that principally for which I want to acknowledge my gratitude. I want to say how important it is that the Norwegian government had the vision to create a prize for the humanities, the social sciences, for law, for theology, to understand that, to gesture toward the importance of fields outside the natural sciences, to say that they're actually significant for our collective well-being and for our long-term health as a culture. And that, for me, is an extraordinary act of visionary significance on the part of the Norwegian government. So thank you all for them. Now I want to say a few words. Yes, it is an amazing thing. And India should be part of this. You should nominate people for this prize. I'll say a little bit about my book because I'm up, despite Willie's kindness, I'm going to operate on the assumption that you haven't read it. So I will show you a few pictures. Let me see if they'll. If
Could we have the slide monitor?
If I push this green button,
slides work.
There we go. So I begin many, many years ago. I don't even I'm not sure, it's at least 60 years ago, it's hard to believe, when I was a student and I was rummaging around in a box of books that were on sale at the end of the year at my university, and I found for 10 cents this book, which I was attracted to because of the cover, truthfully, a mad Max Ernst image. I'd never heard of On the Nature of Things, but I love the cover. And I took it home, and sometime over the summer, though I had no particular interest in ancient philosophy or ancient physics especially, I picked it up and began to read it, and I was amazed by it. This was a poem that begins with an extraordinary hymn to the goddess Venus and to sexual love as the principle in all creatures that continues to make living life possible on Earth. And then I thought I would put it down, but actually I got hooked on it and astonished by it. And so in the course of the summer, I read it and it had a powerful impact upon me. And then I put it away in that part of oneself where one stores things that one has read. I'm no specialist on ancient philosophy. I read it in an English translation, not in the original Latin. And then many years later, on the occasion of a conference in which I was asked to say something about the recovery in the Renaissance of what survived from the ancient world. At that point, I began to think, I remembered that I had read this incredibly powerful book, and I wondered when it came back. And in the course of thinking about that, I realized how important the transmission of these books from the ancient world was. Books don't last forever. Paper doesn't last forever. Papyrus doesn't last forever. The animal skins on which the book parchment were written, they decay. And the entire ancient Roman system of copying broke down when the Roman Empire fell. So a huge number of the books that were written in the past are gone. And what survives as a matter of partly of intention and partly of just wild accident. We know that Sophocles' Oedipus the King only won second prize at the great festival of Dionysus. The play that won first prize, that the judges thought was better than Oedipus the King, has never been discovered. It's lost forever. And that's true of thousands and thousands of other texts. And by a kind of extraordinary set of events, probably partly accidental, a monk sat down. Actually, it would have been on several different occasions because the books don't last, even if they're kept for more than 300 or 400 years. A monk sat down and copied the whole of this extraordinary poem by Lucretius, written around 50 before the Common Era. But that book was not in circulation for reasons I'll explain in a half a second. It survived, but it was not, how should we say, popular reading. And then in 1417, a book hunter with this name, Poggio the Florentine, it says here in Latin, Poggio the Florentine, with the man with beautiful handwriting, who was a book hunter, went off in search of books, not in search of this particular book, but found in a monastery, found this poem by Lucretius that had not actually been part of the conversation in Europe for some 1,500 years. That it was dimly known by a handful of people, but not part of anyone's conversation. And he copied it. He had first someone copy it, then he copied it, and had his friend. I have another image of the friend's copy, Niccolo Niccoli, and that's the copy that set this explosion off. This is a copy that's available in Florence in the library that Michelangelo designed. And I had my hands on this, my gloved hands on this copy, shaking slightly when I looked at it. Why is this so important? Because this poem returned to the world a set of propositions that were absolutely alien to the world of the 15th century, the Christian world of the 15th century. First of all, the argument that the universe has no creator or designer. It's not the result of a God pushing the pieces around and making things. It's the result of a set of accidents, of the conjunction of over millions and millions and millions of years of individual atoms crashing together, forming and unforming things. No creator or designer. Nature ceaselessly and randomly experiments, Lucretius wrote. It doesn't have an intention. He wrote remarkably that the eyes didn't come to being in order to enable you to see. It happens that they're convenient. You can see with them, and that therefore helps reproduction. But nothing is intended. It's all a set of mutations, and it requires a gigantic amount of time, not the 6 days that the Jews and the Christians imagined for the creation. The world was not created for or about humans, Lucretius argued. He said, think of a baby just thrown helplessly on the ground, crying. That's all we are. We're not, the world wasn't, it's not about us. The world doesn't exist for us. It's not our story alone. And then, let's see if I can get another slide up. Why am I not having it? There we go. Humans are not unique. We share the world with an enormous range of other creatures, and we pretend that we're the most important creatures in the world. But this is absurd. We're not the only ones, and we're not going to last forever as a species. We didn't exist forever, and we're not going to last forever, says Lucretius. And more tellingly, the soul dies along with the body. He didn't believe, as Christians did, that the soul was immortal, or as lots of other religions do, that the soul was immortal, but would come apart where the atoms came apart, and we would return to the great swirl of atoms in the world. And therefore, he argued that all organized religions are superstitious delusions. We shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't tremble every time we hear the thunder clap, because the gods are not after us. It's simply not that way. And in fact, religions, he thought, were invariably cruel. They invent the hell that humans fear to enter into. And rather, he argued that the highest goal of life was the enhancement of pleasure and the reduction of pain. That is the summum bonum for Lucretius. This is what we should be after. Pleasure, but deep pleasure. Not, as he says, merely the pleasure of eating. I mean, he thought the pleasure of eating and the pleasure of sex were important, but there's lots of pleasure, and we have to intensify and enjoy the pleasures that we have and help other people to have pleasures on the earth. You can imagine how alien these thoughts were. They're alien now to many people, but they were profoundly alien in the 15th century when they returned. They were thought to be insane when they return to circulation. And slowly, slowly, in a way that I try to describe in my book, the work began to recirculate in the world and to have its influence, not instantly, but slowly, and it shows up in unusual places. For example, in Botticelli's Primavera, which is very much influenced by the gorgeous opening of Lucretius's poem, which is about spring and life and renewal. But it was dangerous. So this person in the very early, actually around late 16th century, very early 17th century, decided to embrace these ideas for his own. A monk, a Dominican monk from Naples, he decided to say, these are my essential principles. And what happened was that he was executed, as other people were executed for embracing these ideas. This is a statue in Rome, in the Campo dei Fiori of this monk. But the work circulated. The work circulated nonetheless, and when it began to be printed, it circulated in a way that was impossible any longer to control by the authorities. This is a copy that was owned by Shakespeare's contemporary Ben Jonson. Johnson was a notorious drinker, and he probably dropped some ink and acid that they used to use to make the ink on his copy, but that's his copy of Lucretius. It began to be produced in this form with elaborate commentaries. Look at the the text of the play, of the poem, are those little lines in the open space, and the rest of it is commentary, in a way that scholars love to do, people like me love to do, and the work managed to make its way into the world and influenced our account of the universe, of the way the stars are made, of the fact that the universe consists of atoms and emptiness, as Lucretius argued, strange dark spaces, but nothing else. And this account of the world, at least so I argue in my book, is our inheritance. It shaped our lives, and we need to understand the extent to which our world was fashioned by this strange, random discovery and return to the world of this marvelous, incredibly beautiful poem. And the last thing I'll say is that, for now, is that it's significant that it was a poem. We think of science and of art, poetry, as two totally separate spheres. But in Lucretius, science and poetry come together in a single form. And the humanities and the sciences need to walk hand in hand to rethink the world then and now. But I'll stop.
Thank you so much. You've touched in those last words on our theme for the festival this year, the bringing together of the arts and the sciences. Venki Ramakrishnan, in his opening address, his keynote, made a plea for that. And we like to hope that this year we've been managing to do this, to bring these two very different worlds which need each other together. Stephen, what drew you personally to this story? You were a writer famous for your close looking at texts, and yet this is a biographical story. It's a narrative story. What do you think was it about Lucretius and about your hero Poggio Branciolini that fascinated you personally?
So I'll start by saying, I think in general, as always, if you write something that matters, there has to be something in yourself that is moved or troubled, that shakes a little bit in relationship to it. So in my book, I described the fact that I grew up with a mother, may she rest in peace, who was terrified of dying and who tormented me as a little child with anticipations of her own passing. And when I read, now many years ago, when I read Lucretius, I was powerfully struck by Lucretius's argument that we really can't ruin our lives worrying about dying. That Lucretius writes, death is nothing to us. We will all die, we know that, but you can't spend your life brooding about dying. So that, the personal side of that is not relevant to, how should we say, you, but to all of us, but it's relevant to me deeply, because if you write about something, you have to have something inside you that responds to it. But then I had other reasons for being interested in Poggio Branciolini, the person who found, a person I'd never heard of before I began this work, but I began to think, who are these people? Who was actually hunting for these books? Who cared about them enough to spend his or her life looking for these books that no one had seen in circulation for a millennium? And I became interested in this remarkable person and in this moment. I've always been interested, always. I've been interested throughout my career in the moment at which the world changed in a significant way, in the Renaissance. The world that suddenly, in which there was an eruption of figures like Michelangelo, like Leonardo, like Shakespeare. How does this happen? How does a culture turn in a different direction? And
this is the swerve of the
title. This was the swerve that I was writing about.
And when we had lunch yesterday, we were talking about how both of us had come from quite religious families. In my case, Catholic, in your case, Jewish, with religious scholars in the family nodding their heads to religious texts. Do you think that background, because this is obviously a book which reacts against that.
Yes.
Is there something in that background which led you to, in a sense, the rebellion?
Of course, reacting against is always a sign that something is in you.
Yeah, exactly.
So I grew up in a quite religiously observant household. I'm actually happy looking back on it that I had that, but perhaps as many of us do, at a certain moment I wanted to repudiate that. I wanted to repudiate what I took to be the narrowness and enclosure of it, and to feel that the windows were opening and that the world was much bigger and that we were all part of a much bigger world. But I'm sure it was precisely in response to the rather enclosed world in which I grew up. And I say, looking back on it now from my old age, I'm actually happy that I had such an upbringing. I mean, because it actually dug deep inside me, and I can draw upon it even now.
Yes, you can reject it, but you could never lose that grounding, and the interests it gives you in these things.
And my parents, I mean, in the Jewish world, the one thing that we had going for us was that they crazily admired scholars. Scholars were the biggest thing for them. So-and-so is a professor, they would say.
Very similar in this culture too. There's huge quoted on education and scholarship. Yeah. And talk about Poggio for a minute. Is he looking for Lucretius, or what's his methodology? Is he going from monastery to monastery, and I mean, he can't examine every book in every monastery? What was his method?
Poggio was a nobody from a small town, Terranova. Now it's called Terranova Bracciolini after him, but a small town in Tuscany. He made it in the world because he had unbelievably beautiful handwriting, as I said. It's a sort of Gilbert and Sullivan idea. And he also had very good Latin. And he became a protege of a famous scholar, Lucio Salutati in Florence. And he got caught up in the excitement of the late 15th, 14th and 15th century, triggered by Petrarch, the great poet Francesco Petrarca. Became obsessed with the idea that we could recover something of the lost ancient world. We live in a decayed, miserable world in which we've lost the glory of the past, and he went on his way to try to find, if he could find traces of that lost world. And that's what started to happen in the 14th century with Petrarch and continued into the 15th.
And just to sort of paint a wider picture for those that may not have studied the Renaissance, describe, in a sense, the amplitude of this. People lowering themselves down into ruins.
Yes.
Raphael with torches trying to find old Roman frescoes. The art as well as the thought of the.
A lot of it had to do with, as you say, with digging in the earth. This is the moment at which objects that had been, of course, farmers had been digging up statues for centuries, but mostly they burned them to get the lime that you can get when you burn the marble.
Beautiful marble statues.
But suddenly people became interested in holding on to those statues, in seeing them and thinking about where they were from. And the same principle applied to texts. What if we could get these back? What if we could get Cicero back? What if we could get the great poets, Catullus, Propertius back from the, what if we could find more things by Virgil from the past? And eventually, Greek came into the picture as well. So Poggio was part of that world, and they were incredibly competitive with one another. It was a nasty world. Actually, Poggio was a rather unpleasant man in certain ways, a fighter. They were all competing with each other to try to find and recirculate these lost subjects. He had no idea that he was going to find Lucretius. He wasn't in search of that, but he had memorized the names of many ancient writers whose texts had not been seen for centuries. And so when he finally saw the text, by the way, Willie says, digging in the earth or lowering yourself like Indiana Jones into a well. But in fact, Poggio Bracciolini and most of the book hunters found their texts in library catalogs, the catalogs of monasteries. They said
in this
they would
case
show up,
in Germany.
Yeah,
Right?
In Germany, in Switzerland. This happened in Germany. They would show up and they would say to the monks, could we have a look at your library? I'd like to look at the list of books in your library. And they would look through them, and so it is less Indiana Jones than it is you or me going into an archive and trying to find something.
Yeah. And what would have led a Christian monk who's dedicated his life to the search for God to have spent presumably many months copying out a poem which denies the existence of God?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. Why did they do this? And the answer, there isn't a simple answer except to say discipline. That the monks, the monasteries believed first of all, they believed, and that was crucial, in literacy, because you had to read the sacred scriptures. And they began to copy the sacred scriptures. Of course, they had to keep copying them. And that copying extended to non-sacred, non-Christian texts as well, as a discipline of having to sit there with a quill and ink, cursing to yourself and the cold, and copying
a little
something.
marginal note saying it's like 2 hours till dinner time or
Yes,
something.
exactly. I can't stand it. I have a hairy piece of parchment. They didn't take the hair of the animal off. I can't write correctly. It's ruining my text. I mean, there are many complaints that are written on these texts.
And in those nice Irish texts, when he's talking about the cat that's mousing beneath him, and he's sitting there copying out the Book of Kells or
Yes,
something.
exactly.
And,
No, it was an extraordinary act, some of the monasteries at least began to pride themselves on the sheer number of books that they possessed, and they weren't worried about whether those books were Christian or pagan.
In how complete was the loss of the classics in Europe? If you, at the time that Poggio was living, most of the great works of the classics that we now have were in the process of recovery, or was
No, not at all. I mean, in fact, even now, of course, probably 80% or maybe closer to 90% of the classics are lost, which may be a good thing. I mean, only because we'd be overwhelmed by what has come back from the past. But it's worth remembering that Dante, for example, the great Italian poet of the Divine Comedy, that Dante writes about Odysseus, Ulysses, but he had never read Homer, because Homer wasn't in circulation at that point in Europe. I mean, it had been certain texts had survived in Constantinople, in what's now Istanbul, in the Greek world, but had not been circulating in Europe.
Then others, meanwhile, were coming back through Islamic Spain. There was
Exactly.
When Toledo is conquered by the Reconquista, the Islamic libraries are intact.
Exactly. So, in fact, Islam is a crucial transmission because Islam had kept alive many of the texts. The only text of Plato that was circulating throughout the Middle Ages was the text called the Timaeus. The rest of Plato was not available. No one had it. It was Islam that kept it alive.
And these wonderful early book hunting monks crossing the Pyrenees and going down to Toledo,
Yes.
learning Arabic and finding translators, or finding translators who knew Arabic, and then producing new. I mean, Gerard de Cremona alone translates 30 or 40
Yes.
of these texts.
I mean, what we have to hold on to is the sense, first of all, that culture doesn't last unless you keep it alive. It disappears. Everything disappears. We know that. But a whole culture, a rich culture, whether it's India or Italy or my country, the culture doesn't make it if no one is interested in keeping it alive and transmitting it. And there are long periods of time, and there, in the case of Europe, from the time in which the Roman Empire collapsed to all through those early centuries in which schools stopped, scriptoria, the places where they copied texts, came to an end. Nothing was being transmitted, so that a huge amount is lost. And it's important, to me it's important now, because I feel that it's our collective obligation to transmit the precious culture that we have to the next generation. But there are forces in our world, I'm sorry to say in my world preeminently, who are not the least bit interested in transmitting the culture to the next generation.
You were talking at lunch yesterday about how even now texts which were once in common circulation are falling out of circulation, that no one is reading anymore.
Yes, it's a combination. Part of it's the effect of these things and of the way in which we circulate. Partly, as I know from my students at Harvard, a decline actually in reading, sitting down and holding a book and reading it, and partly it's a kind of shrinking of a commitment to the humanities, which is partly the effect of the rise of the importance of STEM. I mean, all of which these are complicated subjects, but what I want to say is hold on to what we have, to the precious inheritance that we have from precisely, to go back to the introduction of the Holberg, precisely to the world of the humanities, the world of theology, the world of law. These are what keep us alive as human beings, and it's crucial that we hold on to them.
We should say that in this country there is a similar danger with the loss of manuscripts in Sanskrit. Today, I think only something like 5% of Sanskrit texts have ever been translated out of Sanskrit.
I had no idea.
And that there are huge numbers of Sanskrit classics in libraries in India which are decaying from lack of care, which have never been translated, never properly analyzed. There are probably wonderful, wonderful works of mathematics and science and humanities which we do not know of. Amazingly, Aryabhatta, who was such a foundational mathematician and who is now taught in every school textbook, who worked out the circumference of the Earth and the distance of the Earth from the Sun and the fact that the Earth spins on its own axis. He was unknown until the 1950s when his texts were discovered in libraries in Pune. And his importance in world mathematics. So India is very much part of this story too. There's a very similar danger that crucial foundational texts are out there now which will not be out there maybe in 50 or 100 years.
I want to say things might be out there, as it were, digitally, but that doesn't mean we possess them. We possess them in ourselves. So I'm completely fascinated, actually, by AI. I have to be fascinated by it because probably my students are using it all the time in writing their papers. But even apart from that, I am working with someone to load into, used in the large language models, everything that Shakespeare not only wrote, but everything he read. So I'm fascinated by this, but I also think that it's dangerous. It's dangerous because we need to hold on to what makes us human beings. We can't turn it over entirely to our machines. So that the more that we can actually absorb in ourselves as humans, the inheritance from our past, the more we can actually transmit to the future what it means to be human as we turn over more and more of our lives to machines.
Stephen, the last thing I'd like to ask you before we open this to questions is the decision you took to write this not for an academic text, not for an academic press, but for what people call a trade press, in other words, for general circulation, for the ordinary reader. And in a sense, in this case, not write in academic language, not write for your fellow scholars primarily, but for the general reader. Were you worried? And at the time, was it were you worried that your colleagues would regard this as sort of cheapening your
my brand? I didn't worry too much, to tell you the truth. I maybe should have worried, and I certainly got a certain amount of pushback. But I found something odd, which is that more academics have read my trade books than have read my academic books. So I have ceased to worry about that insofar as I had any. I do think that we face a serious challenge. I was perfectly happy in a certain way to write books to try to impress my best friends with how clever I was, but that were incomprehensible outside my tiny circle. That's how you get tenure at American universities. And I played the game quite happily, and I enjoyed it. But at a certain point, it occurs to you, and I'm speaking to Willie Dalrymple about this, that there's a world elsewhere, a world outside this tiny circle of readers, and that it's actually crucially important to speak to that world. Yeah. Because if what I was saying bears any truth at all, which is that the transmission from generation to generation is hugely important, then the idea of writing for the tiny group of people who read academic books is a disaster. No one reads them, or the tiny number of people read them, but we need actually to convey what's most important to a broad general readership. The crucial thing, as I said to Willie at lunch yesterday, is that you have to realize how you can't write down to such that's fatal, to think that, well, what I have to do is to simplify everything, to make it obvious, to make it vulgar for everyone. That's actually not the way to do it. You have to figure out how to convey what is passionate in you about, in my case, about Shakespeare, about Lucretius, to more than the tiny group of adepts.
Professor Greenblatt is too modest to say it, but this book went on to win a Pulitzer, several other major prizes, and was about 6 months or longer on the top, on number one on the New York Times bestseller list, and reached hundreds of thousands of people who otherwise would not have read about Poggio Brancolini or Lucretius or have even heard of them. So it's a measure of what can be done when a brilliant scholar reaches out beyond the academy.
This is being said by a person whose book is number one on the bestseller list at the moment.
We have 5 minutes left, and I know there'll be a lot of questions. And straight away in the front row, sir, waving your program next to Suraj.
Thank you very much. This is Saeed Hussain Qadri, or Ubermensch doppelganger for the Discord Empire Club family.
You are our most frequent questioner. Very good to meet you.
Wonderful. Professor Greenblatt, I was always inspired by your works. In fact, it reminded me, Ibn Khaldun used to always talk about maintaining group identity, otherwise civilizations would rise and fall quite frequently. How do we square this conundrum of preserving culture and promoting multiculturalism at the same time?
That's a very interesting question, and it is certainly the case that a vision of cosmopolitanism without identity has tantalized people. The dream of a universal language, the dream that you can erase all differences. But I think that's a misunderstanding, actually, of how the important transmission of culture takes place. I think that it's important, and this goes back to something we said at the very beginning, to dig down into your actual local identity if you're ever going to reach out beyond that. That is to say, I think that what looks like a paradox, that a profound difference between the global and the particular and local is actually is not. The idea that that's a paradox is not true. That what happens is that you can only reach out if you reach in to yourself. And I think that that's one of the exciting things about the idea of living in a culture, is to embrace it and think about it and bury yourself into it and then emerge into the light.
Sudeep Sen.
Thank you, Professor. I've been a great admirer. Just a quick question. What is the value of recreating a classic which is already a classic? By which I mean, say, for instance, Derek Walcott wrote the Omeros.
Yes.
And did it indeed, got him the Nobel Prize. And many such examples are there in our history and literature. I'm just curious to know, since you like poetry,
Yes.
what do you think about that?
I think that when I was in college, I remember a professor, a rather conservative professor of mine, who loved Shakespeare, saying, why don't they just do Shakespeare the way Shakespeare would have done it? First of all, we don't know how Shakespeare would have done it. But secondly, that's death to the classic. The classic needs to be renewed. The classic needs to be reimagined. Omeros, that marvelous poem by Derek Walcott, doesn't actually take away from the Odyssey. It actually reinvests the Odyssey with excitement and energy. Vishal Bhardwaj's films, Shakespeare adaptations, Makbul or Haider, these are ways of actually keeping Shakespeare alive, not ways of burying him.
Very nice. This young lady here.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful session. You talked a lot about Lucretius and his impact on humanist Renaissance thought. I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned that he believed that it was the pursuit of human life to minimize pain and maximize pleasure. Did that have an impact on future political philosophers, particularly someone like John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism?
Yes, a wonderful question. I mean, take a step back to say that Lucretius came back into the world in a culture that specialized in valuing pain. And that's one of the most remarkable aspects of late medieval, early Renaissance Christian culture, was that it celebrated Jesus' wounds, it celebrated the pain and suffering, not pleasure. And so it took a tremendous struggle, actually, to get pleasure, curiosity, wonder back into a conversation in which it was valued. And what lies at the far side of that is precisely, as you say, people who begin to say, yes, in a deep way. I mean, in my American world, Thomas Jefferson, who became president of the, but who also wrote the Declaration of Independence, values the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is a noble goal for a whole society. That would have been inconceivable. The pursuit of happiness in any medieval culture. And that is precisely what you're describing.
Pursuit of self-flagellation.
Yes, exactly.
The young lady here. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating discussion. Your 2018 book, Tyrant, Shakespeare on Power, has been described by some critics as a critique of the earlier Trump administration. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts now that Trump is back in power? Thank you.
Stirring the pot there.
Yeah.
There we go.
First thing to say is that I don't mention the name Donald Trump in my book, Tyrant. I don't do so not out of discretion, though maybe now in the unpleasantness of the current regime, discretion would have been wise, but rather because I wanted to argue that sometimes it's important to think obliquely, not to think directly, because one of the things that's been terrifying about this moment is the sheer amount of noise that comes from this. This is not an administration that I admire, not surprising, but it's a kind of, we say, brainworm in which you can't get it out of your head. It's noise all the time banging at you. So in that circumstance, sometimes, not always, sometimes it's important to try to think slightly obliquely, to try to rethink one's world, to try to get out of this nightmare. But the question is how to get out of the nightmare, and one, I don't have a solution. I thought I had done my job 8 years ago via Shakespeare. I wrote a book about how it's possible for a culture to fall into the hands of a catastrophic leader. And I thought it wouldn't happen again, but it obviously is going to happen again and again. And each time we have to try to rethink our way out of it.
This monastic world you're describing is the books that were kept in the monasteries were the kind of the items salvaged from a shipwreck,
yes.
Right? Because so much of the science and learning and astronomy and mathematics, all this advances in human civilization made during the classical period, 90% of it is swept away in this downburst. Things can go again. Because we have reached this point in civilization does not mean that if decisions are taken by politicians that these cannot go massively in reverse.
Yes.
Whether it's medicine and
Yes.
and research.
We will hold on to our human culture and our values, I hope, through the dark days that I'm afraid lie ahead.
Stephen Greenblatt, a big round of applause. Let's hear some noise for this great, great scholar and writer. Thank you.